Welcome to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This lecture is intended for students enrolled in the Academy's World History course. If you're not enrolled and would like to join us for self-paced studies, visit classicalliberalarts.com. My name is William Michael. I'm the Academy headmaster, and I'll be leading this study of Meyer's General History, which is the history text that we use in the Academy's World History course. Now, this first chapter of this general history focuses on what are called prehistoric times. And this is a controversial topic. By prehistoric, we mean that we're referring to the earliest history of human life on Earth, which appears to begin before human records are available to us. So based on records alone, based on human records alone, written records and so on, history only goes back, our knowledge of history only goes back to around 4000 BC or so. But there's reason to believe, based on evidence, that human beings were active on Earth for some time before that. So we're going to study this question of prehistoric times and also seek a general introduction to human history in this first lesson. Myers, the author of this book, was an American historian. And when we talk about historians, we need to realize that these are not philosophers or theologians. These are men who discuss the past based on available evidence. And that's important to remember that. He's a historian, so he speaks based on what material evidence is available. And that may lead him at times to some conclusions that would appear to contradict Christian thought. But again, I want to remind you that you should read this text and study in this course with a critical mind, because history is based on evidence. So we're not going to talk about things that we believe. We're going to talk about things which appear from evidence that's available to us, whether it's written evidence or artifacts that are left behind by men. Whatever evidence can be put together by different scientists and historians, that is the source of our knowledge of what we call history. So don't get that confused with, let's say, the history of the Bible, where we read a divinely inspired story of the origin of the world and the history of men, even the interactions between men and angels or the devil. That all belongs to theology, to sacred doctrine. In this world history course, we're focused more on a secular study of history. So Myers was an American historian, and he was an educator. He lived from 1846 to 1937, and he wrote this great world history textbook in the early 19th or early 20th century. This textbook provides us with a broad understanding of human civilization from its earliest beginnings. Very useful for the development of a background knowledge of world history that will help us in all of our studies. It's important to note, for example, St. Augustine said in his work on Christian doctrine that anything that assists us in the study of sacred scripture is worth learning. And one of the subjects that he had mentioned was the study of history, because to understand the sacred scriptures, to understand church doctrine, church history, and so on, we have to understand the history in which these religious events took place and developed. So world history is of great importance for all of our studies, including theology. So, having said that, before we get to the reading of the text, let's take a moment to commit our study time to the Lord and ask Him to bless us as we seek to learn world history. Let us pray together. Lord our God, in your wisdom and love, you surround us with the mysteries of the universe. Send your Spirit upon us and fill us with your wisdom and blessings. Grant that we may devote ourselves to our studies and draw ever closer to you, the source of all knowledge. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, as for the reading, when we read in history, we often do a lot of reading, so I'm not going to include the readings in the lectures. If you want to study history, you're going to have to get used to doing a lot of reading. So what I would like to recommend at this point in this lecture is, if you haven't yet read the lesson for our world history course, lesson 1, pause the lecture, go and read through the lesson first, and then come back and pick up where we leave off here. Mark the time in the lecture. Go do that first reading as you're supposed to, as it's explained in the article, How to Study for Mastery. Make that first reading just from beginning to end. Don't take any notes. Don't worry about understanding anything. Just read through the content of the lesson to learn what the lesson contains. What's this lesson even about? What are we going to study? And so on. And when you've done that first reading, then come back and continue through this lecture. For those who have done the reading, let's move on to the division of this first lesson. We can divide Meyer's first chapter in world history into 4 significant parts. The first part discusses the nature and scope of prehistoric times, the nature and scope of prehistoric times. The second part begins where we read in the Old Stone Age. And this second part is about the 3 great ages of prehistoric development. The 3 great ages of prehistoric development. The third part of the lesson begins where we read, in this and following paragraphs we shall deal or dwell briefly upon some of the special discoveries. This third part discusses the great achievements of prehistoric man, the great achievements of prehistoric man. And then lastly, part 4, the legacy of prehistoric times, begins at we of this 20th century and continues to the end of the lesson. The legacy of prehistoric times. What is the significance of prehistoric times? What influence has our knowledge of prehistoric time had on our understanding of the world? So these 4 parts, the nature and scope of prehistoric times, the 3 great ages of prehistoric development, the great achievements of prehistoric man, and the legacy of prehistoric times, give us a good overview of the content of this lesson. And now our goal is to study each of these parts, and as I always explain, to work to understand every sentence in the lesson. Remember that a sentence expresses an individual thought, and therefore, in order to learn every idea that the author is working to communicate with us, we've got to work to understand every sentence in the lesson. So to get started with this interpretation or study of the meaning of the content, let's go ahead and get started in the first section of the lesson, considering the antiquity of man. The antiquity of man. The author writes the following: we do not know when man first appeared upon the earth. We only know that in ages long past, when both the climate and outline of the continents were very different from what they are at present, primitive man roamed over them with animals, some of which are now extinct. Remember that the author is a historian. He's talking about what we can say about the past from the evidence that we possess. So when he says we do not know when man first appeared upon the earth, he means from the evidence we cannot tell for certain when man first appeared upon the earth. He's not denying the teaching of the book of Genesis. He's speaking based on material evidence. After all, if material evidence truly contradicts our interpretation of Scripture, it's possible, even likely, that our interpretation is what needs to change. So it's important for us to listen to historians and learn about the evidence that's available, because our interpretation is based on what we know about the history and details. And if that changes, our interpretation may become false. So he's not denying Scripture. He's simply saying, as a historian, we don't know when man first appeared on the earth, but we know that the world appears to have been different, and there were different animals on earth, there were different plants on earth. Many of these things have become extinct. And so we're trying to piece together what exactly was going on in the earliest moments of human history. He goes on to say, around 5000 BC, the historic curtain rises. Around 5000 BC, in some favored regions, such as the valleys of the Nile and the Euphrates rivers, there were nations and civilizations already venerable with age. Very interesting observation he makes. When he says the historic curtain first rises, he uses this imagery from a theater to show that written history begins around 5000 BC and raises the curtain on human history, reveals to us what's going on at that time in human history. The civilizations of Egypt in the Nile River Valley and Mesopotamia in the Euphrates and Tigris River areas, those civilizations were already established. They were already considered ancient and sophisticated societies when the first written records appeared. That is, they seem to be developed at the beginning of human history. The evidence speaks of them and reveals that their culture, their learning, their traditions had already been established. That's what leads us to consider prehistoric times. Where did these civilizations come from? How did they develop? When we talk about human writings, we assume that they have languages established, written alphabets, they're able to communicate, they've got paper and pens and ways to write things. All of that would have already had to be established before the histories could even be written. So we see that the presence of this early human history suggests to us that these people had been around for some time. And that's why we consider this study of prehistory. The author goes on to talk about the difference between the prehistoric and historic ages. He says, the uncounted millenniums means thousands of years, the uncounted millenniums which lie back of the time when man began to keep written records of what he thought and did and of what befell him, these are called the prehistoric age. So he defines prehistoric time as what could be a vast period before human writing was developed. The word uncounted, when he says uncounted millenniums, expresses the great length that's possible for this period. Remember, he said, we don't know. We don't know when the beginning was. It's possible it could have been thousands and thousands of years. I would argue that that's not reasonable, because it wouldn't make much sense for man to live for thousands and thousands and thousands of years without any writing, then all of a sudden produce writing and rapidly move towards great achievements in writing. So I would argue that this extended length of prehistoric time is not a very reasonable idea. But again, we're considering just what the evidence tells us, not what religion or even reason says about it. So he's talking about uncounted millenniums, thousands and thousands, millions, possibly millions of years. We just don't know. We don't know when human history began. But we do know that when human history begins and there's writing, civilization is already established. He says the comparatively few centuries of human life which are known to us through written records comprise the historic age. The comparatively few centuries of human life which are made known to us through written records comprise the historic age. So he proposes that there may be uncounted millenniums of years before human writing, but there are a few centuries, which is kind of an understatement, several thousand years actually, of written records. So there may be more history, he says, that we don't know through human writing than history that we do know. And of course, that's just a speculation. He can't prove that from any evidence. He's saying it's possible. There's no way to know for certain. He mentions a number of civilizations which, at the dawn of this written human history, are already well established. He says, in the valleys of the Nile and the Euphrates have been discovered written records which were made at least 4,000 or 5,000 years before Christ. These river valleys, the Nile in Egypt and the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, produce the earliest known sources of writing because their fertile soil supported large populations of people. The fact that they simply had water and food, they were able to support large populations, and these civilizations were pressured to keep records, develop trade agreements, maintain laws and government policies, write histories for the rules of kings and so on. So there was reason for the development of writing in these great civilizations. The fact that they're dated, however, before Christ is always significant, because it shows us how the life of Christ really provides order to all of human history. There's history before Christ, and there's history in the Christian era, the era that we now live in. So for 5,000 years or so, 5,000 years before Christ, we have had access to written human records from which we could draw a knowledge of human history. Now, it's also worth noting that just because we have human records doesn't mean we have an accurate knowledge of human history. We know that human beings lie. There's all kinds of reasons why people would be tempted to write narratives of events that aren't even true. Maybe they were trying to accomplish something of their own. Maybe they were trying to hide something or cover something up. We know that human beings lie all the time. So we can't imagine that because we have human writings beginning around 4,000 or 5,000 BC, that now we have this absolutely certain source of knowledge of human history. And before that, it's all mysterious and unknown. That's not true at all. And so bringing other sources of evidence into the study, not relying entirely on human writing, but also looking at other things, looking at geography, looking at remains that are found by archaeologists, bringing into the study of history knowledge from other fields, from other sciences, can help us to actually check the accuracy of the written records we have before we waste time studying them, assuming them to be true when they may not be. The author goes on to say, we say that the historic period began in those lands, so the lands of Egypt and Mesopotamia, 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, so 4,000, 5,000 BC. In most other regions, the historic period began at a much later date. So the historic period, what we mean by historic period, is the time when written human records become available. In the lands of Egypt and Mesopotamia, we're talking 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. In other places, later than that, more recently. He says different people developed writing at different times because they had different circumstances and different needs. So it shows us that human progress as life develops on Earth appears to follow natural patterns. Things develop in different places, not at the same time, but often in similar ways. And so we can learn about history by studying the most ancient civilizations and applying that knowledge to our study of later civilizations. He says the truly historic age did not open in Greece and Italy until 800 or 700 BC. If you've studied world chronology, the course that I wrote for younger students, you'll know that we mark the beginning of the classical world at the time that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that time, if you notice, is right here where the author says the historic age began in Greece and Italy around 800 or 700 BC. The great civilizations of Greece and Rome developed later than Egypt and Mesopotamia, as the ancient Romans and Greeks explain themselves. They talk about this all the time. And so Western culture, which is the culture of Greece and Rome and Europe that spreads into America over time, that culture developed at a later date than the earliest ancient Near Eastern cultures, but followed similar patterns, and the study of the ancient cultures helps us to understand the later cultures. The author goes on to say the long period of prehistoric times is divided into different ages, which are named from the material which man used in the manufacture of his weapons and tools. So when historians look at prehistoric times, normally through archaeology, by digging things up and attempting to identify the times when whatever they find, whether it's a buried city or whether it's treasures at the bottom of a sea, it could be layers of ruins that have been left behind as cities have been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt again and again through history. When archaeologists who study the beginnings of things, when they literally dig up these ancient cities, they work to try and figure out the chronology of when the things that they find, when they had taken place. And they use all different source of reasons and evidence to try and accurately date things. Very interesting study. But when these archaeologists do this, when they look back at the past and consider all the things that they have been able to recover by digging up these different locations, they've divided prehistoric time into different ages because they've noticed that men seem to have used different materials at different times. And so there are ages of prehistory that relate to the materials that were used by men living in those different times. The author says the earliest epoch or age, the earliest age is known as the Paleolithic age. And that word Paleolithic simply means Old Stone Age. Paleolithic means Old Stone Age. So the first epoch, the first age of prehistory, is known as the Old Stone Age. The following epoch is known as the New Stone Age, the Neolithic age, the New Stone Age. And then a later period is known as the Age of Metals. So we move from the Old Stone to the New Stone to the Metal. Those are the three divisions of prehistory. And again, notice that the ages are based on the materials, the tools, the different implements and things that have been found, which seem to relate to different periods of development of human history. So even though we don't have writings that give evidence of human activity, we do have other sources of information. We have things they left behind, the tools they used, houses they built, ships that they sailed, all these different resources we are able to discover by means of archaeology. And so we have evidence beyond written evidence. And this leads to this division of prehistoric time into Old Stone, New Stone, and Metal ages. The Greek terms that are given, like Paleolithic and Neolithic, help us to understand the progression. And as I mentioned, Paleo means old, Neo means new. In the age of metals, just as we see a change, or as historians, I should say, see a change in the materials from the Old to New Stone Age, there's also a development over time where metals develop. So we move from, let's say, copper and bronze to iron and so on through time. Think of the metals we use today, how advanced they are: stainless steel, aluminum, titanium, and so on. You can imagine finding a city that was destroyed and buried underground in 1500 AD, where they were using simple metals like iron, and then digging up a city that was established in 2000 AD and finding aluminum and stainless steel. You could see how the different times and the different levels of civilization can be seen in the materials that are being used by the people in different places. So that method of defining different ages seems to be reasonable and worth paying attention to. However, he says the division lines between these ages are not sharply drawn. So we have to be careful not to oversimplify things. Human history, as we study it, is messy. It's gradual. It doesn't happen all of a sudden. Things take time. Things develop over time, sometimes by accident, sometimes by intentional developments. But the progress of different civilizations, different peoples in different places, it's gradual, and things happen at different times, usually in the same order, but at different times. New technologies are developed by one group, but then they're shared with other groups. And so those technologies develop more slowly in other groups. And we see this in all different areas of life. So different peoples might be living at the same time, but be using different materials because one is advanced, one is discovering these things and using them first, and the other is following them, learning from them, imitating them, and using them at a later time. So the development of these ages is a good general guide to organizing prehistory, but it's not to be oversimplified as if there are clear-cut dates when we move from the Old Stone Age to the New Stone Age, or when we move from the Copper Age to the Bronze Age, or anything like that. So let's not oversimplify this attempt to try and create some order out of the different periods of prehistory. He says, in most countries, the epochs run into and overlap one another, just as in modern times, the age of the steam power, the steam engine, ran into and overlapped the age of electricity. So we can see all these same ideas present in modern history. He uses a helpful modern example to show us how technological changes happen gradually and sort of overlap each other in different places. Even today, moving on from steam and electricity, we can look at automobiles where we've moved or are moving from gasoline to electricity. We can see how this is happening in different places at different rates. Very interesting to go back in history and look at the time of the world wars, because we have video from those times and we can see tanks and all kinds of military equipment, even airplanes being developed during the world wars, while people were still using horses and mules to do farm work and to move around. So we can see how these ages overlap each other and how that would look in prehistoric times. He goes on then to discuss the first of these ages, which is the Paleolithic or the Stone Age. He says, in the Old Stone Age, man's implements were usually made of stone, and particularly of easily chipped flints. Sometimes, though, he used bones or horns or tusks from animals, and other material was also used by the Old Stone Age. But primarily what identifies it is the use of simple stone materials. Early humans showed intelligence, choosing the best materials they could find. Flint was a type of stone that was used because it could be chipped away and shaped with sharp edges to form useful tools. The same thing was true of bones and tusks, even wood. It was important, you can see, to try and develop tools, usually that were sharp, because we needed to divide and break or cut things that we couldn't do by hand. So there was a desire for sharpness, sharp tools to dig or to cut, even to kill. And flint was good as a stone for that purpose, but also bones and tusks and wood and so on. But this is the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. He says the rude tools and weapons of Paleolithic man, which are found in gravel beds in river areas and in caves, are the oldest things in existence, shaped by human hands. He says rude tools. That just means things that are simple or roughly made. Like if you were to go out into your yard and make a hammer out of whatever you could find, you would find a stick, maybe find a big stone, and you might tie them together with something. That would be a rude tool. It's not a well-crafted, not a finely made tool. It's rude. It's a first attempt based on what happens to be available. So the weapons and tools that were used by Paleolithic man, they were rude. They were simply put together from simple materials, and it's a sign that civilization is really just developing. The man of the Old Stone Age, we read, saw retreating glaciers of the last great ice age, of which geology tells us. So you can see there's more information being studied by scientists and historians. We have here the mention of geology, the study of the earth. This connects human history with geological time, or history as it's understood by geologists, showing that there's evidence that early humans lived through times where there were dramatic changes in the world, dramatic changes in climate. We can look at places and see glaciers, giant bodies of ice that move over time through different areas. Sometimes they increase, sometimes they decrease. Sometimes great areas of land are completely covered in snow and ice, and at other times that ice melts away and those lands become available. Plants begin to grow, animals move in and begin living in those places. These climate changes lead to life in different areas, in different locations, and of course, that all becomes a part of this prehistoric study. Among animals which lived with man on the continent of Europe, we know most of Paleolithic man here were the mammoth, wild horse, and reindeer, species of animals that are now extinct, which are no longer found in the regions where primitive man hunted them. The mention of extinct animals like the mammoth or the reindeer helps us to understand how the world was likely different in many ways during prehistoric times. Obviously, you'll hear people talking about things like dinosaurs, which makes things even more interesting to think about if things like that are true. But these all relate to evidence that becomes available as scientists dig up the earth, dig into giant glaciers, lands that were covered with ice become accessible to us as the ice melts, areas where there were seas or lakes or rivers dry up, and all of a sudden, whatever is at the bottom of those water bodies becomes available to us to examine. We learn all different things about different times, and there is evidence that animals lived on the earth which don't exist today. And again, not necessarily, wild things like dinosaurs, but the mammoth, which is like an elephant, the wild horse, which is similar to horses that men make use of, the reindeer, which is similar to elk or deer, and so on. Similar, but different. Different species can be found, different plants can be found, and so on. So it's clear that human history also includes great changes in life on Earth, changes in the weather, changes in plants, animals, tools, materials available, where people live, and so on. Moving on, we read, what we know of Paleolithic man may be summed up as follows. He was a hunter and a fisher. His habitation was a cave or a rock shelter. His implements were, in the main, roughly shaped flint tools. He had no domestic animals, no tamed animals, no farm animals, save possibly the dog and maybe the reindeer. He was practically ignorant of the art of making pottery. There's no evidence that pottery was made. So we have a summary of the character of Paleolithic man based on evidence that's found in different places from different times. He was a hunter and a fisher. In other words, he wasn't a farmer. He didn't grow his own food. He didn't keep his own livestock. He didn't raise cattle. He didn't raise chickens for eggs or sheep for meat or anything like that. He was a hunter and a fisherman. He lived in a cave, didn't establish his own land or home. He was really living in a survival mode during this Paleolithic age. The length of the Old Stone Age no one knows, he says. We do not attempt to reckon or count its duration by centuries or even millenniums, but only by these geological ages. So they don't try to be more specific than they can be based on the evidence. They just refer to them as ages. They don't go down to the level of trying to assign years to these periods and things like that. So our desire to know exactly when these things took place, that's really not proper for prehistoric studies. We'll just stick to referring to things in different ages. That's how we should do it. He says, we do know that the long, slow epochs did not pass away without some progress having been made by primeval man, a progress that was prophetic of the great future that would come. Even in the earliest times, human beings, as they were just establishing their society, they were already making advances and developing things little by little, showing that they had the capacity to progress and develop and become more and more perfect over time. This progress is part of human nature. It shows us that there's something unique about us. If we study the culture, let's say, of wolves or cattle or any animals, we won't see cattle improving their culture over time. We won't see them developing any implements for use. They won't develop their own feed bowls. They won't improve the quality of crops where they graze. They depend on man to make those improvements for them. But we see the faculty of reason present in prehistoric man, which allows him to develop his own culture. Man is created to be the ruler of creation, and we see that natural reasoning power in the ability for man from the beginning to make steady progress. Now, there are times where that progress explodes, but in the early prehistoric times, there are records, or there is evidence, I should say, there is evidence of a slow but steady development of human culture, which says something about human nature, which distinguishes man from all other animals. Before the end of the Old Stone Age, he learned to use fire, as we know from traces of fire that are found in caves where Old Stone Age men lived. He had invented the bow and arrow, pretty clever if you think about it, and is evidenced by arrowheads of flint and of bone which have been discovered. So fire and the bow are signs of major technological advances. We can compare them to modern advances. I mean, to think that when fire was brought under human control, that was just as radical a development as when electric lighting and heating became available in modern times. So we see this development of technology even in the earliest society. We see this improvement of human life, which again comes from human nature. The author says this important invention gave man what was to be one of his chief weapons in the chase and in war, down to and even after the invention of firearms late in historic times. The bow, which he mentioned before, remained important, even continues to be important today for thousands of years, even though so many other weapons have been developed. The bow and arrow were around from the very beginning of prehistoric history. It shows how some inventions are so great that they're never really replaced. They are always held on to by men, even when other developments become available. Very interesting to see that some of the things that were developed from the beginning or discovered from the beginning are still in use today, thousands and thousands of years later. As strange as it may seem, the man of this epoch was in his way an artist. Even the earliest humans, they didn't live like animals, but they had an artistic sense. They had the ability to create, to imitate nature, and so on. And it reflects the image of God present in the human soul. They have a divine spirit in them that separates them from all animals. And when we talk about art, we're not just talking about making things pretty. We're talking about the ability to use different forms of expression to express different experiences or interests in human life. Man is capable of studying himself and communicating with other men and even with future generations. He thinks about the future. He's reasonable, and so on. Very interesting to think about the significance of art in the life of early prehistoric times. We move on then to the New Stone Age. The Old Stone Age was followed by the New. Chipped or hammered stone implements still continued to be used, but what characterizes this period was the use of ground or polished implements. In other words, over time, the tools and the implements get better, and that allows them to make better tools and implements. There's a joke that men sometimes say when they talk about the tools in their garage. They say, "Oh man, I've got so many tools. I've got tools to fix tools." That's the idea. Tools develop, and then those tools allow man to develop new and better tools. So not only does the use of tools improve, but the use of tools leads to the discovery and development of better tools. And we see how that continues on and on through history. The Neolithic period shows technological advancement while still living in the use of older materials, polished tools, ways to make things stronger, to make things sharper, to make things lighter, and so on, become developments that characterize this new Stone Age. The North American Indians, the author says, were in this stage of culture at the time when the New World was discovered. Very interesting. The Native Americans, when Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, when Europeans began to settle the American continent after 1492, around 1500, let's just say, when these European men settled North America, the Indians were basically living like Neolithic men. Their culture was similar to that of the Neolithic age. Very interesting to think about, to show how cultures develop at different times, but in the same ways. This helps us to understand how different people develop at different rates. Not because there's a difference in their ability, but really due to the different circumstances and opportunities that they have in different places. The author says, Neolithic man in Europe was in many respects much advanced over Paleolithic man. He had learned to cultivate the soil. Notice the differences in the skills. He's moving away from being a hunter and a gatherer. Now he's cultivating the soil. He's gardening and farming. He learned to make pottery, to weave. He tamed various wild animals. He built houses. He buried his dead in such a manner with gifts to show that he believed that there was more to life than life before death. He believed that there was life after death. We see all these different aspects of human thought, human nature, human reason, and so on, developing society as man lives in this prehistoric time. He goes from being a wanderer who lives in caves and just hunts like a wild animal for food to becoming a farmer who's settled on a piece of land, who cultivates the land, who raises his own animals, who produces his own fruits and vegetables. We see the cultivation or the civilizing of human life as time goes on, as human reason works itself out. Moving on, we move to the age of metals. So we have a good sense of the life of Paleolithic man with crude or rude, basic flint tools. Moving on to the Neolithic period where things get more polished and refined, where man's life becomes more stable, where he becomes more self-sufficient, and so on. And this leads us to the age of metals. Finally, the long ages of stone passed into the age of metals. This age falls into three different subdivisions. So the geological ages of prehistory divide into Old Stone Age, New Stone Age, and the Metals Age. But the Metals Age itself divides into three different periods: the age of copper, the age of bronze, and the age of iron. Copper, bronze, and iron. So as we study the development of human society, we see a movement from copper, which is the first metal that's discovered and used, into the age of bronze, and then into the age of iron. Some peoples, like African Negroes, passed directly from the use of stone to the use of iron. But in most of the countries of the Orient, that is, Asia, the East, and of Europe, the three metals came into use one after the other in the order named. The history of metals has been declared to be the history of civilization. Indeed, it would be almost impossible to overestimate the importance of metals to man. Man could do very little with stone implements compared to what he could do with metal implements. And I'd like to ask you, why do you think that is? What is it about metals that makes them more useful than stone? What is it that makes metals so important? Why is bronze better than copper? Why is copper better than stone or wood? Why is iron better than bronze or copper? Think about the qualities of the metals and what benefits they offer to men as they're discovered and developed. The author lists a number of them for us here. He says, men could do very little with stone implements compared to what he could do with metal implements. We could think of making tools that are sharper with metals. We can talk about making tools that are stronger with metals. A stone is very strong, but it chips and breaks, whereas metal can sort of stick together and maintain its strength even when it's dropped or struck with something, whereas stone would chip and break. Metal can be more durable. It can bend and give and take a beating, whereas, like I said, stone just breaks, as strong as it may be. So the availability of metals and the development of tools and implements made of metal expands what human beings can do. It allows them to build better tools. It was a great labor for primitive man, even with the aid of fire, to fell a tree with a stone axe. Imagine cutting a tree with an axe that was made out of stone. It was difficult to hollow out the trunk of a tree for a boat, take a big tree trunk and simply hollow out the center of it to make like a canoe. Very difficult to do that with a tool that was made out of stone. So this provides us with some clear examples of the kind of work that men had to do early on and how the materials that they had available allowed them to do them better at different times. He says it was only as the bearer of metal implements and weapons that man began really to subdue the earth and get dominion over nature. Metal really gave man power to fulfill his end, which in Genesis chapter 1 we learn was to subdue the earth, to keep God's order on the earth among the plants and animals. Metal is what really allowed man to be able to do that effectively. He then goes on to talk about the importance of fire. In this and following paragraphs, he says we shall dwell briefly upon some of the special discoveries and achievements, several of which have already been mentioned, marking important steps in man's progress during the prehistoric ages. Prominent among these developments, among these discoveries, was the discovery of fire. Now, it's hard for us to even imagine what life might have been like before fire, or at a time when fire was simply difficult to make use of. We not only take fire for granted today, but we have use of electricity, which is kind of a controlled form of fire or energy that allows us to do the things that fire can do in an even a radically more controllable way. I mean, think about it. We can use electricity to heat. We can electricity to light up a room. It has the effects or functions of fire, but is far more useful and convenient to man. But try to imagine life before fire, when fire was difficult to come by, difficult to maintain, and so on. By far, it would have been the most important human discovery. The author says, as to the way in which early man came into possession of fire, we really don't know. Possibly, he kindled his first fire from glowing lava that had flown from a volcano or from a burning tree trunk that was set on fire by a strike of lightning. We're not sure how man began to take hold of fire. The mystery of fire's discovery reminds us that many of the crucial developments in human history, I mentioned this before, remain either unknown to us or happen by chance, all of which is kind of hidden in God's providence. So man didn't just develop everything by his own reasoning and planning and work. Much of human development, even in modern times, was discovered by accident. And this may have been true of man's early use of fire. However this may be, he had in the earliest times learned to produce the spark by means of friction. The fire borer is among the oldest of human inventions. Only gradually did primeval man learn the different uses to which fire might be put, just as historic man has only gradually learned the possible uses of electricity. By some happy accident or discovery, he learned that it would harden clay. Fire could be used to dry out and harden clay. And he became a potter because of that. It would also smelt ores. And so man became a worker in metals. That fire would aid him in 100 other ways. So fire was much more useful than just being a source of heat or light. Men realized how different substances in nature respond to fire and the interesting effects that fire has on different products. It can make clay harder, for example. It can purify metals and so on. Fire presided at the birth of nearly every art or quickened its progress. No other agent has contributed more to the progress of civilization than fire. Indeed, it is difficult to conceive how without fire, primitive man could ever have emerged from the Stone Age. Fire really was the discovery that allowed man to begin to make greater progress. In the next section, we talk about another change that happens as human society develops, the domestication of animals. Again, we mentioned in the Paleolithic age, man was a hunter or a gatherer. He went out and gathered fruits and vegetables that might be available in nature, in the wild. He also hunted animals to capture for their skin or for meat. But as human society develops, man begins to domesticate or raise his own controlled animals. The author says, when we visit a farm today, we observe the friendly nature of life which goes on there. The horse proudly and obediently bending his neck to the yoke, the cow offering her streaming udder to the milkmaid, a woolly flock of sheep going forth to the field, accompanied by their trusty protector, the dog, who comes fawning to his master. This familiar intercourse between men and animals seems so natural to us that it's hard to imagine, it's scarcely conceivable that things may once have been different than this. So here Myers paints a very, very clear picture of modern farm life to help us think about how remarkable the taming of animals or the domestication of animals really is. The way that a farm is arranged and all the different animals all live and work together peacefully is really remarkable to think about. But we tend to take it for granted as if that was just always how things were. But that does not seem to have been true. That seems to be something that developed over time. He says, yet, in the picture, we see only the final result of thousands and thousands of years of the work of civilization, the enormous importance of which simply escapes our notice, because it's by everyday wonders that our amazement is least excited. We take domesticated animals for granted because we're just used to them. They've been around as long as we have. We've never lived in a time where these things weren't so. But the truth is that the domestication of animals was actually an amazing achievement that required great patience, great intelligence, and great skill by men over the course of many, many centuries. So it's something that we need to learn to not take for granted. He says most of this work of inducing the animals of the fields and woods to become members or dependents of the human family, to enter into a league of friendship with man and become his helpers, much of that work was done by prehistoric man. When man appears in history, remember around 5,000 BC, when man appears in history, he appears surrounded by almost all of the domestic animals that we know today. The horse was already his willing servant. The dog was his faithful companion. The sheep, the cow, and the goat shared his shelter with him. By the time of written records, domestication already seems to have been complete, showing the great achievements of prehistoric peoples. Now, I would mention one thing, raise one objection. Some people will say this doesn't prove anything like that at all. Some would say from the beginning of human history, from the very first time human records were available, what this author says is true. It seems that the domesticated animals were always living with and around man. So this idea that there was a time when animals were not domesticated, when man lived without domesticated animals, that's just a bunch of myth. That's just a bunch of nonsense. There's no evidence of that. I would say that that's a good argument that we could raise. And so the question is that perhaps scientists and historians have evidence of animals that are now extinct, which seem to be more wild, and don't have evidence of domesticated animals living before the historical period. So that's a good controversial topic to think about and question as we read about prehistoric times. The author says the domestication of animals had such a profound effect upon human life and occupation that it marks the opening of a new epoch in history. The hunter became a shepherd. The hunting stage in culture gave place to the pastoral age. Pastoral referring to the keeping of animals like sheep and goats. So this development where man moves from being a hunter to a shepherd, this represents a major change, or major transition in human history, human society, I should say, from nomadic hunting. A nomad is a person who really doesn't have a home but wanders from place to place. Seems to be a real shift from nomadic hunting culture to the more settled life of herding and farming, which would provide more reliable sources of food for human beings and which would allow population to grow. Women can be healthier. Women can bear children and raise healthy children because the food sources are all around them. It doesn't take great efforts and even dangerous missions to go out and try to find food. The food becomes more readily available, becomes available in greater quantities, becomes available in greater quality, and that allows population to develop and increase over time. The author moves on from animals to plants and discusses the same sort of development among plants. He says, long before the dawn of history, those people who were to play great parts in early historic times had advanced from the pastoral to the agricultural stage of culture. Agriculture represents another major advance, moving from pastoral life, where even though that's more stable and settled than hunting, it's still not as settled and stable as farming or gardening. So the movement from pastoral life, keeping animals moving about with all the benefits of domesticated animals, moving from that to agriculture, where man is actually cultivating and improving soil and crops and pastures on which he lives, represents another major advance in human civilization, allowing for even larger populations and more complex societies to develop, as we see in history. Just as the step from the hunting to the pastoral stage had been taken with the aid of a few of the most special species of animals, so this second step was taken by means of the domestication of a few of the innumerable species of seed grasses and plants growing wild in the fields and in the woods. So just as the domestication of animals allowed human society to develop, so also did the domestication of plants. Myers shows that there is a parallel that can be shown between the domestication of animals and plants. And the work that's required here is important because in order to improve the quality of animals, man needs to identify the highest qualities of those plants and animals and then control their reproduction so the characteristics or features of the animals and of the plants improves over time. You can see how much planning and how much order and control had to be exercised in order to succeed in carrying that out. Wheat and barley, he says, two of the most important cereals or grains, were probably first domesticated on the plains of Babylonia and from there carried over Asia and Europe. These grains, think about wheat and barley, which are like the foundational food of human life. Think Jesus says man cannot live by bread alone, because it's almost true that he can live by bread alone. And the plants from which bread is made, namely wheat and barley, these cereals or grains or grass plants were cultivated over time. And if you learn about farming today, you'll see they're still being cultivated today. Scientists and farmers are still working to improve the quality of the different plants that they grow, because they learn that by controlling their reproduction, they can make them better and stronger in all different sorts of ways. They can make fruits taste better, stay fresh longer, resist dangers caused by diseases and bugs, and so on. Lots of amazing things can be developed by domesticating plants, just like animals. And the benefit is that agriculture both allows and requires people to stay in one place, to improve their lands, to take care of their crops. And this allows for the development of permanent settlements, the development of towns or villages and cities, because people are remaining in one place, not wandering from one place to another. And so the population can then thicken, as the author says. Villages grow into cities, great kingdoms are formed, and the political history of man begins, where man begins to try to figure out, how in the world am I supposed to manage this growing, complex society? And we see the development of these civilizations in valleys like the Nile River and the Euphrates. Agriculture enabled the development of complex civilizations with large populations, specialized occupations, different kinds of work that's focused on in different places based on the land or the conditions in those different places. And as those as those societies developed, the organization of governments and new questions about politics and laws and so on. Now, one of the more interesting developments, as I mentioned, when human writing becomes available, language had already been established. And we have to ask the question, where did this language come from? How was language formed? The author says another great achievement of primitive man was the making of language. One author writes that the main work of language making was done in the ages before history, and that appears to be reasonable. Language development was completed or had to be completed before written records could begin, making it another great achievement of these prehistoric people. Periods of time, like geologic epochs, must have been required for the formation, out of the speech of the first men, of the rich and copious languages already on the lips of great peoples of antiquity. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and Romans, when they first appear in history, have developed language. We need not dwell upon the inestimable value to man of the acquisition of language. Without it, so far as we can see, man must have remained forever in an unprogressive and savage or semi-savage state. Language is essential for transmitting or saving knowledge. Any of this work of coordinating complex activities, domesticating animals and plants, managing large farmlands, all of it required communication, would have had to have an already established language in place for culture to develop, for religious ideas to be passed, for political ideas to be established, for laws to be made. Language would already have to be developed. And this reflects the rational nature of the human soul that would enable this development to take place because man has the capacity for rational thinking and language that allows him to communicate and share that reasoning. As language forms, this also leads to the development of writing. The author writes, still another achievement of prehistoric man, and after the making of language, perhaps his greatest achievement was the invention of writing. Writing allows for the preservation and sharing of knowledge, not only from one group of people to another, but across generations, from the dead to the living. Writing is extremely important for the development of human culture. And there are two kinds of writing: picture writing and sound writing. The author says there are two kinds of writing: picture writing and sound writing. In picture writing, the characters are rude pictures of material objects. And we can think about Egyptian hieroglyphics, and we're going to study this in future chapters. But the attempt to communicate by drawing pictures is one form of writing. This way of representing ideas seems natural to man, Meyer says. It's a form of writing that's still in use among some American Indians. But in phonetic writing, in sound writing, the symbols don't represent things that exist in the world. The symbols represent sounds of the human voice. So there's a difference, two different ways to communicate in writing, one by drawing images, and another by using symbols to represent sounds of spoken language. And he says that there are three stages of the development of this phonetic language or sound writing. Three stages of development. In the first stage, each picture or symbol stands for a whole word. In such a system as this, there must be as many characters or signs as there are words in the language that's represented. In working out their system of writing, the Chinese stuck fast at this point. So think, if you're going to write with pictures or symbols, then every word has to have a different symbol. And you can see how that's going to require us to memorize and use thousands and thousands of different symbols. That's very, very difficult. So it may seem like a good idea at first, but when we start getting into it, and the vocabulary and the words get more and more numerous and complicated, we learn over time that that's really not a very good way of handling complex language. So the author says in the second stage, the symbols are used to represent syllables instead of words. Symbols are used to represent syllables or spoken sounds instead of words. This reduces the number of signs that are needed from many thousands to a few hundreds, since the words of any given language are formed by combining a relatively small number of syllables. We can call this syllabic writing, where the written symbols represent syllables. With between 400 and 500 symbols, the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians were able to represent all the words of their languages. So even though that sounds crazy to us to think of a language with hundreds and hundreds of symbols, 400 to 500 different symbols, and that's still much easier than a picture-based system or a word-based system where there would have to be thousands and thousands of symbols. And this leads to the third stage of the development of written language. The author says, symbols are used to represent not words, not syllables, but elementary sounds of the human voice. The symbols become true letters, a collection of which is called an alphabet. And this mode of writing is called alphabetic. This is the system of writing which we employ. So we could use symbols to represent words, but there are thousands and thousands of words. We could use symbols to represent syllables, but we can combine sounds in hundreds and hundreds of different ways, make many syllables. But what if we go even further and say, no, let's just figure out what sounds can be made with the human voice and create a symbol for each of these sounds. It may sound like there would be a lot, but the reality is there's a very limited number of sounds that can be made with the human voice. Normally only 20 to 30 different sounds. And so there are 20 to 30 different symbols that are needed, and each of these symbols becomes what's called a letter. The collection of those letters is called an alphabet, and that kind of language is called alphabetic writing. So the simplest form, where sounds of the voice are represented with symbols, is actually the most useful form. And that's the form that we use today. Our alphabet in English has 26 letters. The ancient Greek alphabet had 24 letters, and so on. There's not many more or less than that. That's what our voice is capable of doing. The author writes that what people invented the first alphabet is unknown, but as early as the 800s BC, we find several Semitic people in the Middle East who possess a true alphabet. Through the agency of traders, this alphabet was spread to the east and to the west and became the parent of most of the existing alphabets of the world. If you compare the alphabets of different languages, like the Hebrew and Greek and English, you can see that the letters have similarities because they likely came from an ancient Middle Eastern alphabet. Most people say that it was Phoenician. With the invention of phonetic writing and the practice of keeping records with names of men who do different things and the dates of the events, the historic age was able to truly begin for man. So if we wonder, why would there not have been written records for all of human history? This could be the answer, because the development of language and writing takes a long time. And so it may be reasonable that man would live for thousands of years or hundreds of years before any written records, because the ability to write was one of man's greatest and most difficult developments. So that's a pretty good argument for why we should expect there to be some significant prehistory before the availability of written human records. Moving on, the author says, we of this 20th century, and we live in the 21st century now, but we of this modern century consider ourselves to be fortunate in being the heirs of a noble heritage, the heirs of all the past. We're not used to thinking of the men of the first generation of historic times as the heirs of a great legacy. Notice he's saying that we think of ourselves as the heirs of this great culture and development that took place in history, but we need to think back to the beginning of history, the beginning of the availability of human records to those civilizations, and realize that they also were the heirs of great achievements that had been obtained through prehistoric times. He says, the scanty review that we have made in this chapter of what was discovered and thought out by man during long epochs before history began cannot fail to have impressed us with the fact that a vast bequest was made by prehistoric man to historic man. The achievements, he says, of prehistoric people, and we think about them: fire, agriculture, domestication, language, writing, all of these things that must have been developed in prehistoric times. These were given to the first generation of historic man after the dawn of human written records. And these developments provided the foundation for all other civilization. He writes, if our hasty glance at those faraway times has done nothing more than this, give us this sense of appreciation for prehistoric achievements, then we shall never again regard history as has been our wont. We shall see the story of man to be more wonderful than we once thought, the path which he has followed to be longer and more toilsome than we ever imagined. But our interest in the traveler will have been deepened through our knowing more of his origin, of his early, hard, and narrow life, and of his painful first steps in the path of civilization. The author argues that understanding what was accomplished by prehistoric men and the difficulty of that development should increase our appreciation for human achievement, and as we reflect on it from a Christian perspective, should also make us more appreciative of God's providence in guiding human development. Again, this is all very controversial and uncertain, because we're talking about sources of evidence and trying to put different sources of evidence together that we really don't have any kind of living commentary on, because we're talking about prehistoric times where there's no human writing. But just by thinking about the conditions of the dawn of history, where written records are available, languages seem to already be established, great advances in domestication and agriculture and politics and law seem to already be in place, we have to wonder whether there was a period of time before that when these things developed. So it's a controversial question to think about. We could also make the argument that when God created man, he created man with all of this culture already established, that God himself provided domesticated animals, domesticated plants, language, and so on. So There is a religious response to this that could be made, that could argue that all of these things were given to man in the beginning. And I think we should think about the argument that could be made for that. So that brings us to the end of the interpretation, a lengthy lesson, of course. I hope that that's helpful. I'd like to leave you, before we finish here, with 12 points that are worth memorizing to really master the content of this lesson. Let me give you 12 points to commit to memory. Number one, the prehistoric age includes all the time before humans began keeping written records. The prehistoric age includes all the time before humans began keeping written records. Number two, the historic age began about 5000 BC in Egypt and Mesopotamia when writing was invented. The historic age began around 5000 BC in Egypt and Mesopotamia when writing was invented. Number three, prehistoric times are divided into the Old Stone Age, New Stone Age, and the Age of Metals. Prehistoric times were divided into the Old Stone Age, the New Stone Age, and the Age of Metals. Number four, Paleolithic people were hunters and fishers who lived in caves and used chipped stone tools. Paleolithic people were hunters and fishers, who lived in caves and used chipped stone tools. Number five, Neolithic people learned agriculture, pottery, weaving, and animal domestication. Neolithic peoples learned agriculture, pottery, weaving, and animal domestication. Number six, the age of metals progressed through copper, bronze, and iron, greatly improving human capabilities. The age of metals progressed through copper, bronze, and iron, greatly improving human capabilities. Number seven, fire was essential for pottery, metalworking, and advancing beyond the Stone Age. Fire was essential for pottery, metalworking, and advancing beyond the Stone Age. Number eight, animal domestication changed hunters into shepherds and enabled more reliable food sources. Animal domestication changed hunters into shepherds and enabled more reliable food sources. Number nine, plant domestication led to agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex civilizations. Plant domestication led to agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex civilizations. Number 10, language development enabled the transmission of knowledge and cultural progress. Language development enabled the transmission of knowledge and cultural progress. Number 11, the invention of writing marked the beginning of recorded history and preserved knowledge permanently. The invention of writing marked the beginning of recorded history and preserved knowledge permanently. And lastly, number 12, prehistoric peoples left a vast inheritance of achievements to historic civilizations. Prehistoric peoples left a vast inheritance of achievements to historic civilizations. So that's your memory work to summarize this lesson. So in this lecture, we have studied very carefully Chapter 1 of Meyer's General History on Prehistoric Times. We've discussed the antiquity of man, the distinction between prehistoric and historic ages, the three great prehistoric periods, the major achievements of fire, the domestication of plants and animals, the development of language and writing. Having gone through all of this, and we have gone through the entire content of this chapter, It's now time for you to reread and study the lesson for yourself. Develop your understanding of the content of the lesson and demonstrate that understanding using the graded assessments that are available in the World History course in the Study Center. If you have any questions or need any help with this lesson, please visit the Academy Help Center at classicalliberalarts.com/support. Once again, my name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I hope that this lesson has been helpful. God bless your studies.